Welcome, one and all, to the Ferret and Raccoon podcast, episode 222. I am your one and only host for this podcast, the Angry Raccoon, bringing you the last podcast of July 2023. And two things I have to say real quick before we get into this fairly short episode is, first, I unfortunately do have a bit of a sore throat, unfortunately. Work has not been, I would say, kind, but I've had to use my voice a lot, unfortunately, and I just can't recover at the moment. Luckily, I have time off now, but still, there was no way that I was going to actually recover or actually have a better sounding voice before this podcast needed to be up, so I apologize if I sound terrible or sound much worse towards the end of the podcast. And for those of you who maybe have good headphones, you may be able to hear that it is raining at the moment. The weekend that I am recording it on, it's said to be raining throughout the whole of it, so there isn't too much I can do about that, so I apologize again. But yeah, it's been an interesting couple of 2 weeks. There hasn't really been much to talk about in terms of trailers and news, and there's been other stuff that hasn't been very interesting or worth my time for the most part, and I kind of like to, as I've said previous times, I don't like to add filler to the podcast. So we've just got another 3 trailers, so we'll see how that goes. In terms of things I've done, to be honest, I've mainly just been listening to music. A lot of artists I like and a lot of artists I've discovered have been dropping new music, so I've been really enjoying hearing some great stuff and anticipating new albums that are set to release in the coming months, some already releasing already, which I've had on repeat for a little while. But the main reason why I've been listening to music is because I've essentially been planning and organizing things in a big way. A lot of these, plans are for the future of the channel, video making, content, that kind of stuff. So you're probably going to hopefully see some changes in the coming months, both on this channel and potentially in other ways and other places, to not spoil anything for the most part. But let's get into the trailers that we have for this episode. And the first we have is very interesting. We have Godzilla -1, which the trailer itself is like literally 35 seconds long. It's short, sweet, straight to the point. This is how it should be done, Warner Brothers, who were the people who made the awful Godzilla films that came out a couple of years ago that had nothing to do with Godzilla and just drug that franchise through the dirt and into the ground, in my opinion. And yeah, it's honestly just disgusting to see that kind of practice is still happening, where Western studios just kind of take beloved foreign franchises and just completely destroy them for the most part. But let's talk about this trailer for the most part. And it's interesting that we're getting a kind of prequel to Shin Godzilla, which kind of came out a couple years ago, as this film, I believe, is some kind of, this film seems to be a prequel of some kind, but it's interesting that this is a sequel coming off a reboot, and as that's what Shin Godzilla was. And I do wonder what this film can or should add to the series, at least this Shin series, or the newer wave of Godzilla films, which I'm sure they're going to be doing, that Toho are going to be making in the upcoming years and months. But this one is being directed by Takashi Yamazaka. Sorry if I mispronounced his name. As Hideaki Anno directed Shin Godzilla, and Anno is well known for being the director of things like Evangelion and Naya and the Blue Waters and some other really great stuff. Even his kind of mini Shin series, where he's done Shin Kamen Rider and another beloved Japanese mascot franchise character. He's kind of been doing his modern day takes on these, like, what if they were a thing, or what if they happened today. That's kind of what Shin Godzilla is. How would the world or Japan react if Godzilla was real? How would the world would react if, Kamen Rider was real, or how it would look in a modern day aesthetic setting, which I think he's a very creative guy to be able to translate fairly old and of the time media into a interesting way for the most part. And Shin Godzilla, I haven't seen in a while, is a fantastic film that kind of, it intentionally does evolutionize, not evolutionize, that's not even a word, I don't believe, evolves the series and does some interesting things with it. It kind of is the ultimate Godzilla film that I think people have always kind of wanted, where it kind of combines both elements of what makes Godzilla being Godzilla roaming around Japan, destroying things, and people talking about how they're going to stop Godzilla, but in an interesting way that makes sense in the context of today's time. So it is interesting, as I'm very interested to see how this new director is going to, or if they can even live up to Anno's creativity on the previous film. And I mean, this looks horrifying from the few seconds we see. We see Godzilla and people just running in fear. It's like very quickly cut, like just quick scenes of just panic, destruction, terror, horror. And I love it. Like, it's actually presenting Godzilla as a worldwide or Japan-based threat rather than a plot convenience that some of the Western Godzilla films have done, where they just treat him more as a nuisance and that he's going to die at the end of it because we've got to show Americans being great and powerful and they can do anything. You know, the stupid, like, you know, fantasy that Americans have. The saying that Americans love seeing Americans. They don't really, or are not really attached to anyone who doesn't have a white face, unfortunately. That's why you'll never, ever really see a person of color be the main action hero for the most part, not unless you're Dwayne Johnson or just really, really, really likable for the most part. And yeah, I'm really interested in this film. I can't wait to see how it turns out, if it's going to live up to the success of Shin Godzilla, if this even is a prequel, because -1 is an interesting title, because it makes me think that yes, it is a prequel to Shin Godzilla, but maybe it's sort of like a prequel maybe even to the original Godzilla film, which was released like way back in the 50s. So it is interesting, and I think it looks promising for the most part. Hopefully we get a UK release over here in England, because it's always nice to get foreign films, especially, I guess you consider them niche films over here. We do get anime stuff, but that would be really nice, even if it's a limited screening for the most part. The next trailer we have to talk about, probably one of the bigger, more mainstream blockbuster looking films we have coming out, is going to be for Napoleon, a sort of biopic on the French dictator, terrorist, war hero, villain, however you want to refer to that man as. But first off, perfect casting, hiring Joaquin Phoenix. He is going to absolutely smash this role for the most part, as he has in pretty much every film. Even when it's not a good film, he is usually the highlight. I mean, Joker wasn't that good of a film, but he was the reason why I think people actually like it. But yeah, I am getting a bit sick, as I alluded to, of biopics, because it's become a bit of an epidemic with everyone and their mum essentially getting one now. But at least this one looks like a film for the most part. It looks like actual craft and creativity and effort has actually gone into it. There have been other biopics on things that don't actually need biopics, like Air, which was a biopic about Nike Air, or the inception of that becoming a thing. And that film, from what I have heard, is essentially just people at Nike being stressed out over the fact that they're making millions, but they need to make more millions, and they want to get Michael Jordan to promote their shoes, which honestly is not really a story that needs to be told or dramatized in a film setting, as well as other just really stupid things like the Tetris, you know, I think it was a TV series, you know, I think that kind of it's common knowledge, the whole origin story with that, especially if you play games. It doesn't need to become a sappy, stupid, you know, biopic story about, you know, what it's about. It's just pointless at the end of the day. And other just random, bizarre things that I'm sure are going to get biopics, things that don't need it. I mean, eventually there will be a Ferret Raccoon podcast biopic where it's all about the tension between me and Ferret and how I kicked him off the podcast because he said this, and how Ace is never returning because he doesn't like me and all that kind of stuff. I purely just made that up. Everyone is on good terms, of course. I know you have to make that clarification, because people legitimately do think that if I did say it, but that's what would honestly happen if it were to happen hypothetically. But yeah, unfortunately Ridley Scott is directing this one, and he's made good films in the past. I don't think he's a good director anymore. His last few films have been complete garbage, in my opinion. Films like, actually no, I don't mind Prometheus. It's films like Covenant and almost anything alien related is just terrible. And I mean, he said a lot of dumb things in recent years, like saying how the reason, he said something really stupid about like Jesus being an engineer, who are the kind of people who exist in the alien universe, Jesus being an engineer, and the Romans killed him or some stupidness. Like, it's fine for you to encompass real life history into your own fiction, but when you start doing things like that and trying to portray it as a sort of factual thing or in a way that can legitimately upset someone's beliefs or faiths, I think that you shouldn't do that in some sense. You know, tell a different story, if anything, or write a comic book for the most part. But yeah, we'll see how this one goes. I mean, it looks pretty epic for the most part. Like, I'm not sure how accurate a lot of this is, because obviously they're going to go a bit overboard. They're going to make things look more epic than they actually were and dramatize things and all that kind of stuff for the sake of story writing. It happens with adaptations for the most part, but it still looks epic. Like, lots of great spectacles, like giving almost every scene like a sort of grand aesthetic that kind of like reflects or foreshadows like Napoleon's legacy for the most part, because he is a very interesting person, although he's not always taught about too much in school for the most part, possibly because of the things he did and kind of who and what he represents. I mean, usually when you talk about, let's say, monsters in history, we obviously talk about people like Hitler, and I'm sure we're going to talk about other monsters like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, who are just like modern day monsters, and they will be remembered as being absolute vile scum in years to come. But with him, I feel like he kind of gets, pushed over to the side, and he kind of gets relegated to just parody. Everyone knows what Napoleon looks like. Everyone tries to do a sort of his accent for the most part, or has the outfit, is always like got one arm in their clothes, because of, they don't really know why that was the case. But it will be interesting. Maybe this will get people more interested in history to some extent. I don't know. I do like Phoenix's performance in this. Like, he's very slow and somewhat stilted in the way he moves and kind of talks. He definitely looks as someone like a war veteran, someone who's been through a hard time, a very calculative person. He's, he almost doesn't really move his lips too much when he talks. It's almost like quite mumbled in some sense, which I kind of like. That it definitely gives him presence, it gives him a character, and it kind of elevates this film, or at least his performance, into more of that of a Shakespearean stage play in some sense. Like, he literally is a caricature of a character or a person to some extent, which is always good. I think it's always nice to see somewhat theatrical drama-esque performances in something that looks as grand as it does in its context for the most part. And the costume design, the costume department has done a fantastic job with this film. Like, they've used and spent their budget really well, as everyone looks the part. It somewhat looks accurate. Once again, I'm not a history buff, so I don't know how accurate everyone's costumes are, but from a face value standpoint, they look pretty accurate. I mean, looking at Joaquin Phoenix, yes, he looks like Napoleon Dynamite. And other certain things, I don't know why I said Napoleon Dynamite there. It's, I don't know. And that's another reason why I think Napoleon is not as well known anymore, and it's because of the Napoleon Dynamite film. Because even just now, I just said Napoleon Dynamite as opposed to the actual person of history. But yeah, the lighting in areas and scenes is very cinematic, with like some really nice examples of moody lighting and color choices. Like, it's some really good stuff. It does look like a legit film, and you don't really get those anymore nowadays. Everything's trying to be a part of a series, and this is just going to be a film that has no sequel, which is great, and hopefully it will be good. Will I see it? Probably not, because I don't like Ridley Scott. But we'll see what happens at the end of the day. And the last trailer we have, kind of shifting gears to some extent in some way, is going to be for Outlaw Johnny Black, which is not what I expected, but it looks good. This is the spiritual sequel to one of the greatest films ever made, being Black Dynamite, with Michael Jai White and Byron Mins, I believe that's how you say his name, returning as similar but different characters, which is always fun. Now, this film was teased a good couple years ago, and no one really knew what it was. It was kind of just touted as a Black Dynamite sequel, but set in the West. And I guess it's kind of evolved into a more original film, kind of somewhat in the same vein as Black Dynamite, kind of, as this one's more comedy than era and genre parody. For those of you who don't know, Black Dynamite is essentially a parody, a fourth wall breaking, to some extent, parody of blaxploitation films that released back in the 70s, 60s, and 80s to some extent, where it kind of just is in celebration of and kind of parodies kind of how things were, how black people were kind of depicted in their own films, kind of taking inspiration from people like Rudy Ray Moore and other examples, Blackula, being one great example and such, and other trends of the time where the Black Dynamite, tiny spoiler, kind of becomes or is kind of half also a martial arts film as well, despite being also a action detective film. Once again, it's a fantastic film. I highly recommend it. And this film itself does remind me a lot of Blazing Saddles back from the 70s, which was a very important and very interesting, somewhat controversial film. Another fantastic film which I highly recommend watching, especially if you like films by Mel Blanc, you like things like Spaceballs and other parody-ish films. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is a direct reference, given it does have a very similar setup where Outlaw Johnny Black is kind of out to avenge his father's death, but he's also kind of posing as I believe as a reverend, while also, hiding as an outlaw in a very, tricky Western setting town. It's great stuff. Like once again, it does have similarities to the, almost Liar's Reveal-esque element that Blazing Saddles kind of has for the most part. And this film has a chilled vibe. Like it feels like something you can just put on, you can just enjoy. It's super simple in its story, likable characters. Everyone seems to be enjoying themselves and playing the part pretty well. And it's really cool to see a Western themed film with a mostly black cast in, once again, a blaxploitation style film. I think that's a very unique angle to kind of present your film or kind of make a film about. It does almost feel like something Quentin Tarantino would make, and maybe once again there's influence there in terms of what this film could be or is about. I'm honestly really looking forward to this one. Once again, Black Dynamite, one of the greatest films ever made. If you've never watched it, you owe it to yourself to watch it. You will love it. There isn't a person on this planet who won't like it, and if you don't like it, you're probably a racist. But that's pretty much going to be the podcast. It's going to be another short one, once again, because there just wasn't anything that I thought was really that interesting, and I kind of wanted to provide you guys with something that maybe you hadn't heard of, or the more important things. There were other trailers, but I didn't really have much to say, and besides, my voice is kind of destroyed for the most part, so I don't really want to be talking too much longer. But yeah, we've got the video of the episode, which is kind of keeping in theme with Outlaw Johnny Black, and that is going to be by Mick Jenkins, with Smoke Break Dance featuring JID, or is it JID? I'm not sure how you actually pronounce that artist's name, but I know it's in capitals JID. But fantastic song that kind of, unfortunately, sums up the kind of world we live in. It certainly is the current mood I have right now, given a lot of the visuals, which are beautifully shot and very cinematic. It's a really cool music video, and the song is fantastic as well. Mick Jenkins is a very underrated rapper. He's been around for quite a few years, and I feel like he doesn't get enough respect, and I wanted to promote him in this episode and hopefully see him and his album and whatnot kind of get more promotion. But absolutely fantastic track, kind of once again summarizing the current mood, the current state of things in black culture, American culture, the world, and of itself in very poignant and somewhat tragic examples and ways. So yeah, hopefully you guys will enjoy that video and hopefully give him more of a listen and more love and support. But yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for the podcast. I once again apologize for my poorly sounding voice, which you can probably tell is getting worse every second, and the rain, if you could hear it. And yeah, isn't anything else much to say other than, thanking you for listening to this podcast, of course. Thank you for making it this far. I really appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel because there's more to come, not just podcasts. And yeah, I guess I will end this podcast like I always do by saying I was the Angry Raccoon, and I will see you on the next podcast.